Make sure. Okay, everybody's in?
I think so. Definitely more than just us two.
Yeah, we have two other persons. I see Sharala and Lynn. So yeah, Miguel apparently thought he had sent it to everybody as usual. I told him you did not. You need to send it again. So let's give the other two persons or so a few moments and then we'll begin. Okay, I think we have enough persons to get started. Let me just get my register off out of the way, and then we can talk risk again. By the way, did anybody take any risks since we met the last time? Anybody took a risk, saw a risk, experienced something risky, reported a risk? No? That's interesting. Okay. Maybe something will come up shortly. Okay, Ebony, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Ebony, wonderful. Any risk issues since we met the last time?
No.
Okay, that's good. So you survived getting from home to work, all of that stuff without any mishap.
Yes.
No divorces, no injuries. Okay, so you see risk is everywhere.
Right.
Okay, welcome aboard. Teresa?
Hi.
You are welcome, lady.
Did I take any risks?
You, Teresa? Or
Did you say?
Report any risk? Take any? Saw any?
I made a large purchase last night. That's a risk, but my husband sees the bill.
I'm so sorry for him. Because yes. Was it a risky purchase, Teresa?
I will sell it as an investment, but it was more of a self-indulgence.
Which, of course, can always be risky. A lot of the risks that we take are as a result of self-indulgence. Okay? So don't worry, you're in good company with self-indulgence risk. Right? Putin's behavior in the Ukraine is self-indulgence. See? What risk is he running, you think? Anybody? What risk is he running? Is he running a risk at all? Oh, that's really just cool. Putin. Vladimir.
I would say reputational risk.
Yeah, even though we already knew that he sucked before, this just adds another dimension to what existed previously. Yes. Okay. Reputational risk.
I'll say market risk, perhaps.
Okay. Why market risk?
I was just having to do with their oil, their exports. And then I would say foreign currency risk, because I was looking at a graph where I think their monies are completely devalued. And I would say currency risk with the not being able to have access to their reserves.
Absolutely. And not being able to engage in any major marketing activity at the moment because of the currency problems and because of the sanctions. So yeah, somehow he thinks though that his military equipment will somehow override all that stuff and he'll come out of this smelling like a rose. Might is not always right. There's great risk in might, because might causes us to feel like we cannot be overcome, that we can overcome anything, do anything we feel like. And that in itself is risky business. Might and pride combined. All kinds of strange things are coming out of that guy over there. Okay, so yeah, absolutely, Teresa. There's market risk, there's reputational risk. Definitely. Anybody smell any other rats? Risk rats? If you think of any, just let it rip. All right. Thank you. Who's next? Anne Hannah. Who's Anne? Off doing something. Okay, Lynn is here, yes. Johnson. Lynn, you still with us?
Yes, I am here.
Okay, excellent. How do you pronounce your first name again, Lynn?
Lenika. Lenika.
Okay, Lenika.
Yes, sir.
Okay, excellent. Very unusual, Lenika. Zainal, are you here with us?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful, wonderful. Are you still at Bank of the Bahamas?
Unfortunately, yes. It's wonderful there. It's such a great place, guys. Awesome.
Is there any risk working there?
What do you mean?
Is there any risk being an employee of Bank of the Bahamas?
Oh yes, a lot of risk.
A lot of risk, yes.
You know, reputation, legal, and we got in some spots,
yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Compliance, fraud, everything.
Yeah, indeed. But you know, the good thing about it is about risk. And this is kind of all of what we're talking about. We're talking about all kinds of different risks all over the place. You can never cover everything in a couple of sessions and all that. Risk is ongoing, it never ends. The good thing about risk, though, is talking about it. See, that's the whole point. And the fact that you are eloquent enough to actually talk about it is a very big deal. It's a step that even senior management people in organizations don't always do. They have an idea that things exist, but sometimes they pretend that they're not there.
Yes, this is very true.
Yeah, in fact, when they're told very clearly they're there and it's brought up before them, put on the video, documented, the whole thing, they sometimes still act as if it's not there. And then if you, as the compliance person or MLRO or some other risk management person, try to keep pushing the issue in your big time quarterly reports about, didn't I tell you guys the last time this risk was here? Why haven't you done anything yet? Then they get mad at you. Start discussing you. Like, do we really need that particular person in risk management? You get the feeling, Mary, that she's doing better than what we really want her to do and want him to do. Maybe we need to make some adjustments at the risk management level. So they get rid of one risk management person who's asking too many questions and bring in somebody who they feel will harass them a little bit less about stuff that they're supposed to be harassed about. So this business of risk management, no matter what capacity you're in, is a very serious thing. More serious sometimes than we talk about it, more serious sometimes than we even imagine until something goes very wrong. But that's okay. Bank of the Bahamas is still going through growing pains, and we know the history of things has a lot to do with everything. And therefore, you guys keep on keeping on because eventually things will settle down at some unknown time in the future. But that's okay too. Just keep on keeping on. Because
yes,
Bank of the Bahamas has to succeed.
This is true. We have no choice.
No. And for some reason, I'm surprised that even the people at the executive level are not making a bunch of noise about how it has to succeed. See my point? Like, put stuff in the newspaper that we have to. And then when you have a speech somewhere, I'd like for you to speak, Mr. General. We have to make a big stink about having to, because you have to. For sure. All right, so hang in there, Janelle. Eventually, you guys will be fine. Everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, everybody has to go through growing pains. And that's all it is right now until things settle down. All right. Thank you very much for that honest response. If only we do more of that, we'd have less risk issues, believe it or not. Okay. Okay. Who's next? Nikisha. Are you there, Nikisha?
Hi, good night. Yes, I'm present. I'm doing well tonight. How are you?
Fine indeed. Thank you. You're on board. Excellent.
Yeah.
Issues just since we last met that you can discuss?
Re-
Say,
Repeat that, please.
have you had any risk issues come up since we last met that you can say or talk about without losing your head? That's an issue. No?
Mm, let me think about that some more.
Yes. Think about it. And if the bulb goes off anywhere before we're done tonight, just wait a minute. I thought about something. Interrupt me and then let it rip. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Let's see. Shirella, are you there?
Good night.
Hi, Shirella. Any major risk issues since we met the last time?
Yeah, so I was running late this morning and didn't stop to the gas station. So I took the risk of, getting to work.
Were you successful?
Yes.
Yeah. So you succeeded this time.
I did.
Have you learned anything from that exercise, that risk exercise?
Life is a risk. It's a game. Play or be played. I'm only kidding. No, preparation is key.
So next time you'll do some things so that you don't have to be worried about whether you what? Run out of gas or?
Yeah.
There you go. The reason why I asked that is simply any discussion of risk without discussing mitigation is kind of futile, isn't it?
True.
Wherever there's risk, we should be thinking, how can we resolve that risk? For example, if your company has a product that creates a product risk for your firm, like maybe crypto something, and the crypto thing looks creepy and spooky and all that kind of stuff, then the risk is that some hanky-panky might go onto your company to that crypto program relationship. So that's the risk. Okay, that's the risk. Now, what are we going to do about it? See, that's the problem. How are we going to mitigate this risk? All too often, organizations make two mistakes. First, they don't want to identify the risks. And if they do, they identify them like likely, like, well, just in passing, oh, you have a couple, maybe a product here, a geographical location there, the normal stuff like everybody else in the world. So we kind of play it down. And then other than directly naming those things that can present real risks, in addition to that, or not doing that, then once they identify it, like, what are we going to do about it? Then everybody's like, well, and then we get stuck on what we're going to do about it, depending on what the risk issue is. Absolutely. Okay. So it's always an issue in risk management issues about what is the risk to the organization? What types of risks does the organization have? Are we all really aware of them? Have we listed them lately like A, B, C for real? Or have we just kind of skimmed over it and say, yes, there is somewhere, and if we see it, we'll report it and all this kind of stuff. And then secondly, what do we have in place if certain kinds of risks materialize? What are we really going to do if it materializes? What do we have in place? What are our plans? Okay. So it's a dilemma that continues to confound organizations. And all too often, decisions taken at the top of the organization does not always help the situation, unfortunately. Which is why the regulators have been fighting with senior management all over the world in financial institutions. Stop going the old way and start doing things the way you know they should be done. Stop doing things that will cause your bank to be fined and your bank to be written up for a million things, opened over the same thing each examination. So stop that. Why don't you just do it? And therein lies the question and the risk issues involved. All right. Welcome aboard, Shirella. Last but not least, Jamie. Okay, Jamie is probably in port somewhere. All right, so let's get started then and see what's next on our agenda. Let me see if I can share the screen. That might help some people. Share screen. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
In case you need to, you may not need to, but if somebody wants to look up every now and then, it's there. All right, so this is where we ended the last time, our discussion on ethics. By the way, has anybody seen anything unethical since the last time? Without, you don't have to call any names. Have you seen anything unethical? Or what you thought may have been unethical? I know it's a weird question. People don't normally ask that question.
I haven't.
Anybody else? Has anybody seen something that they thought was unethical?
Lately they've been talking about the arbicle contracts. You know, wondering where the $200,000, I think it's per month, like where the money went.
Yeah, where did the money go?
Yeah.
Yeah. In addition to being unethical, there are perhaps some criminal issues involved as well, as to where the money went. And wherever there's money, God forbid, there's always room for risk that something unethical, something criminal will come out of the situation, unfortunately. Money has a way of creating all kinds of unsavory situations, drives people crazy still for some reason. Even though we know well in advance that whatever we're planning to do with it, we shouldn't do it. But given the situation, the temptation for some of us is exceptional. And while some of us are happy to leave it alone, others are happy to take a chance. They take a risk because they think if they get away with it, their returns will be significant. And perhaps in one sense it might be, but then in the other sense, it might not. Okay? All right. So these guys are copying. We know what's going on there. They're unethical. Let's see what other risk is. So far, if you've noticed, everything we've been talking about has some kind of risk element attached to it. And I suspect everything we will be talking about will have some risk element attached to it, okay? For sure. So this question about ethics then, is it truth or is it dare? Anybody ever played that game, truth or dare?
Yes, sir.
Oh.
Yes, sir.
What was your experience? Was it more truth than dare that came up, or more dare than truth?
Dare.
Yeah, because people don't want to get caught up in the truth issue.
Truth.
You see, whenever you play the game, for those of you who don't know about truth or dare, whenever you play truth or dare with your friends or colleagues or whomever, you're expected to tell the truth. And so somebody asks you something, you're expected not to lie. You have to tell the truth. And sometimes questions people ask, we don't want to answer. So instead of dealing with the truth side of things, we say, you know what? I'll take the dare side. Dare me to take off my shoes. Dare me to say a bad word. Dare me to take off a piece of clothing. Dare me to call somebody a name. Folks will take the dare any day because the truth side could get a little spooky. Okay, so the question about ethics is it truth or is it dare? The truth is, for some people, it's truth, and for other people, it's dare. All right. We all have to decide individually which side of the fence we are on. That's the problem with ethical issues. Okay? We probably know by now that ethics has to do with principles and standards and how we behave as people, how we govern ourselves as individuals and groups at work and at home, at church, and social functions, whatever the case might be. And so essentially, ethics is all about how we behave, wherever we are. And does this have anything to do with risk? Well, yeah, how we behave creates risk, for sure. I use the example, for example, you have to be careful. Let's say, for example, I'm an older guy now, and so I go walking into a strip joint. Okay, And then all of a sudden, one of my students, like one of you, said, isn't that Mr. Wilkinson? They're like, what the hell is he doing going in there? And so I'm going to be judged by the very place I walk into. Okay, definitely how I behave. Decisions and conclusions are going to be drawn as a result of that. And so this is how ethics work. We will be judged by how we behave. And there are some risk issues attached to those judgments. Specifically in organizations where we work, you probably may have seen these kinds of things. If somebody decides something about you and they start talking about sending rumors in the office, all of a sudden things that may not be true start to stick. And so you wonder, like, is that ethical for them to do that? The answer is no. So truth or dare, it's always which side of the fence we are. Okay? So if ethics is about how we behave, then what is the risk involved in being unethical? Anyone? What's the risk in being unethical? Is there any risk in being unethical?
Well, people won't take your judgment seriously. Or when you decide, make decisions, people will second guess.
Indeed, indeed. Once people decide that you are quote unquote an unethical person, yeah, they're going to start questioning you, your judgment, your decisions, give you that funny look when you show up, whatever the case might be. With that, yeah, we all know that you are. And so this kind of stuff can affect you, affect the way you do business, who you do business with, how people relate to you, and all this crazy stuff. Okay? So it's not just an issue of I can do anything, I behave how I feel, and to hell with everybody. It doesn't work that way in society. And so society will make you pay for unethical behavior. Unless, of course, you hang out with what? Other unethical people. Then there's seemingly no risk there because everybody is behaving the same way. But once you step out of that environment into what we call an ethical environment, then things start to look a little gray. Okay? All right. So even in the ethics of our lives, risk is permanent. It's hanging everywhere, looking to affect us in everything we do. It affects our relationships in the organization with our managers and our boards and our staff and our colleagues and our clients and everybody is impacted by our behavior and vice versa. Right? And any kind of behavior that is out of sync then puts the organization sometimes in a very negative light. Even the general public, depending on what services you provide to the public, if you are behaving unethically in any way, or people perceive you are, then they start talking. They said that those people are not buying, steal people's money. Those people are not buying, do not treat people well. And we start drawing conclusions. And all of a sudden you have reputational risk and other problems coming up that you have to mitigate. Okay? All right. Now, can we make people ethical? No, we cannot. Can we force them to be? No, we cannot. All we can do is to show persons what it's like to be ethical, be honest, be upright, do things right, and hope that they will take the bait. Organizations oftentimes have penalties, obviously, for unethical persons so that we can keep the lack of ethics to a minimum and hope that people will do the right thing more often, because organizations know that the risk of too much unethical behavior can lead to serious reputational damage, and they cannot afford to have that, depending on the type of organization they are and the clientele which they serve. Okay? So for those of us who think like, well, we can do anything we feel, we can act the way we want, it's okay, it's not okay. And remember, stakeholders are always watching. Every day you guys go to work, stakeholders are watching you. Remember, the stakeholders start at the shareholders at the top, the board, senior management, middle management, supervisors, junior staff, the cleaners in the organization, people outside the organization, government officers, everybody is watching to see what you're doing and how you are doing it. And so as a result of that, we have to constantly be thinking to ourselves, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing things that are satisfactory for our organization? Are you doing things that will increase the reputation rather than take away from the organization's reputation? All right, so now, having said that, we can have a little discussion then about something that we probably don't hear about too often, but in practice, we kind of do it in one form or another. Okay? And that is called principles versus rules. Now, what are these principles and what are these rules? We do these things all the time. And after a few minutes, let's see if you can think about whether or not it applies to you in your job. I'm sure it will. Okay? But before we go on, let's take a look at these two guys. Regulation, what's the motivation? What does that mean? But if you just read that piece alone, what kind of feeling you get about these guys? Regulation, what's the motivation? What does that mean? Because remember, a big part of your job as risk people, MLROs, compliance people, and other people in the organization is being able to read people, read environments, read innuendos, read body language, read all kinds of crazy things. Read subtleties. Sometimes the real problems are not that obvious. They're sometimes a little subtle. And if you do not know how to read them. All right. So if you read that, what comes to your mind, anyone? Nothing comes to your mind? Ebony.
Hi.
What comes to your mind when you read that heading? Regulation? What's the motivation?
Like why? Why should we adhere to regulation?
Yeah.
Like what are we getting for it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I didn't really pick on Ebony, but I did pick on Ebony, because Ebony is a regulator. And I would expect that she would have exactly that response to those kinds of questions, like, hey, so what? What are we getting out of it? So in other words, there are persons in organizations who are always looking to get around regulations. As much as we have every turn, there are regulations for this and that and guidelines for this and that from the central bank, from the SCB and commission everywhere in the world. But guys are sitting somewhere and girls are sitting somewhere looking for ways to get around regulations. In fact, some people, their only job in legal or otherwise is to find ways to get around regulations. How about that? And you'd think, well, is that ethical? The answer is no. Is it illegal? The answer is no. So something can be unethical but still be legal. That's interesting, but it's true. Okay? And notice what is said at the bottom. These new regulations will fundamentally change the way we get around them. How about that? So in other words, every time new regulations come out, you have a gang of persons whose only job, it seems, is to find a way to get around it, rather than to conform and adhere to the rules. So this job that you guys have, if you're an MLRO or you're a compliance officer or you're a risk manager or you're a senior manager or you're a board member, whatever your capacity is, the risk issues don't ever go away. And to make matters worse, some of the persons who are violating the rules are participants themselves who ought to be adhering to them. I mean, we have companies every year, some of them are the same companies, getting fined over year after year for the same violations. And so the question is, what the hell's going on? Last year we fined you 5 million, the year before we fined you 10 million, and we come back again this year and you haven't even changed the thing we fined you for. How do you explain it? Okay. So it goes back to the discussion then of who should the risk mitigators be? Regulators try very hard to make the board of directors the risk mitigators from the top and senior management with the hope that at that level, they can somehow put the fear, sorry, not the fear of God. We don't want to say the fear of God. Somehow get those persons down the line to say, look, we are adhering to the rules and therefore we will not tolerate anybody else in this organization violating the rules. Problem is, a lot of the guys at the top, and when I say guys, I mean guys and girls, at the top are often violating the rules, just like these two, looking for ways to get around the rules. As we speak, folks are looking for ways to get around the rules. In fact, some people think, ladies, that this whole discussion about crypto thing is one of the ways to get around some of the rules. This quiet, speedy, swift way to transfer money somewhere and to ting them. Nobody's saying it cannot be legitimate. We're just saying that some people feel that this new thing called cryptocurrency is just another vehicle to circumvent the rules. And so therefore, whether that is true or not, there is definitely inherent risk involved. And so going forward, just that particular product alone is going to be, as you've probably seen, a major source of discussion and issues and problems that need to be mitigated, resolved, legislated, monitored again, monitored squared, monitored cubed, the whole 9 yards, because all kinds of interesting things are going to be going down with that new product that we call cryptocurrency. Okay? The risk issues pertaining to crypto have only just begun to surface. And what we think we know is just the tip of the iceberg about the plans that persons have for cryptocurrency. And like everything else, students expect the good, the bad, and the ugly. They're probably sitting around somewhere, just like those guys we just saw, trying to figure out how to use crypto to their greatest advantage. And it's not all going to be risk-free, for sure. All right? Okay. Couple of terms I wanted you to look at because you're going to see them shortly, then they'll make sense. The first one is regulations. That's Ebony's department. And the other one is paradox. Has anybody ever heard about the word paradox? Anybody ever heard that word? In recent life, years? No? Okay. Well, if you find yourself in a situation where something is supposed to be logical and then it turns out not to be so, or it's supposed to be common sense and it turns out to be a contradiction in terms, and you wonder, like, what is going on here? It's probably a paradox, something that doesn't make sense, that's supposed to make sense. For example, in the old days, when we were growing up, there was an old song about, or a little poem that we used to say about one bright day in the middle of a night. That's kind of a paradox because that cannot exist, okay? One bright day in the middle of the night. Two dead boys begin to fight, see? How could that be? So we're creating some activity that's supposed to be real under normal conditions, but given the other side of the situation, it doesn't make sense. And that's what paradoxes are all about. And we have a lot of paradoxes in the world in which you work, even though you may not recognize them as a paradox. Okay? Maybe after a few sessions, discussions this evening, you might be able to recognize a paradox for what it is. Okay? And we all know what regulations are. Everybody knows what regulations are. Just do it. Doggone it, don't, and do it within the prescribed time and the prescribed way. Okay? bring things into conformity, set it up the way it should go, follow the rules. Because when we come in to check you out, we'll be looking to see if you've done it. Have you changed that INED yet that is supposed to be independent the last time that we found not to be independent for a new one? Notice you haven't done that yet, Mr. Board. Any reason why? Okay. Regulations. So it's an ongoing process. And each time we're discussing any of these things, there is that little quiet thing called risk that just keeps lurking around, waiting for us to not do what is required, to not even mitigate the risk that we are aware of, so that all hell can break loose. I assure you, all hell continues to break loose as we speak. And until somehow we find a way, a remedy to do things the way we're supposed to do them, I'm afraid these risk issues are only going to escalate. Okay? Now, I know, and probably Ebony can say something about that or support, that a lot of work has gone into risk assessments by regulators, not only in the Bahamas, but all over the world. And the reason for that is financial institutions have been asked and are being asked over and over to come up with what we call a risk assessment program or report or manual or whatever the case might be, which specifically says that the company has sat down to think about what its risks are. They are prepared to put it in writing and then say what they're going to do to resolve them should they arise. And if there are any other issues coming out of those risks that have been identified, right? And so regulators everywhere have been trying to get companies to do this. And they keep getting all kinds of versions of this risk assessment. And one of the reasons for that is a lot of companies have not really sat down to consider what their risks really are in detail. That's the first problem. Secondly, those that have sat down to think about it, it horrifies them. Now they have to write it down on paper, item by item. Say what the risk is. Say what they're going to do to mitigate the risk. And then say if there are any other problems associated with each one of them. And then present that to the regulator for scrutiny. For many financial institutions, that is still a nightmare. And so oftentimes they come up with all kinds of different versions. And then the regulators has to say, well, we see the name risk assessment at the top of the page, but we don't see all the information we're looking for in terms of your inherent and other risks that we would like to see. And if you don't do this kind of thing, then you are risking your reputation, your potential to continue to do business, that you could be fined by the regulators, that there could be even more sanctions taken out against you if we continue not to try to identify these things and let us know what's going on. Okay? All right. So risk assessment then is a real issue that is currently on the board and has been on the table for many years, trying to get organizations to recognize their product risk and their geographical risk and their client risk and all the different types of risks that they potentially face given the nature of their business. Okay? It is not necessarily an easy exercise. It's not a complex one, but it's one that has created a lot of issues within organizations, and they're still struggling to come up with a document clearly identifying these things in detail. Okay? So while that simmers then, let us consider something called principles-based regulation. And again, this has to do with how we govern ourselves and how regulators expect us to govern ourselves and how they will look at financial institutions in terms of how they're being governed. So typically we have two scenarios. We have principles-based regulation and we have, you'll see in a moment. But let's look at the principles. How does it work and what is it? Okay? First of all, if an organization is following what we call principles-based regulation, what are they doing? Well, number one, they're moving away from prescriptions, okay? The rules, that's the other one, the rules. Currently, we have a lot of prescriptions that says, read this and tick the box, fill in the blank, fill in the space, tick the box. Those are very prescriptive. Do you do KYC when you're onboarding clients? Do you do CDD when you are looking at PEPs? If the PEP seems reasonable, but it needs to be approved, who does the approving? The compliance officer, or does it go up to the board level? If it goes to the board level, what dollar value are you looking at? Are there any intermittent approval levels, and so on? Tick the box, okay? So principles-based does not consider ticking the box so much. It looks to move away from that prescriptive stuff. Instead, what they're looking at is saying, okay, we're here to do what is right. We don't really want to press the customer with too much stress unnecessarily, only the key things that they need so that we can get on with the business of things, because they trust us and we trust them. And that's how we're going to run our organization, based on those principles. Okay? What that does typically is it puts the burden on senior management to behave a certain way so that persons down the line in the organization can see this and say, okay, I see the principles on which they operate. They don't lie to customers. They don't cheat customers. They don't charge them the wrong rate. They don't give them misinformation. They don't lie about the person. So we're watching this behavior and we're developing a certain set of principles by which we do business. And the belief is those persons who operate on a principles-based regulation pretty much can have a minimum amount of stress in dealing with their clients and even the regulators, just by simply giving the environment of we're going to do the right thing kind of thing. Okay? And that's what principles-based is all about. Okay? It's a broad set of behaviors. Everybody's watching the top. The top has a certain thing. This is how we operate. And these are our guidelines. And we expect that if we're doing them at the top, that everybody down the line will follow through. We don't need any ticking of the boxes and breathing over people's shoulders and all this kind of pressing. All we need is to decide we're going to do the right thing and then do business. Of course, there are a lot of people who don't really subscribe to that because that has some issues attached to it. Okay? In fact, even regulators are sometimes not happy with that perspective because regulators feel that that's too much leverage for persons in organizations to get away with murder. Okay? Instead, the new environment is more, we prefer the more prescriptive thing. Okay? We prefer the rules. We prefer that we have a clear set of questions that we can ask you that you can respond to, and we're clear on everything that we want done, and we can go back and verify them by A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3 that you have done that. We don't have to sit around and try to wonder if you've done it properly, if you're going to get to it, when you're going to get to it. These are the rules. Fill in the boxes, fill in the information, send the annual report, send the quarterly stuff, so we can see month by month, quarter by quarter, year by year, exactly what's going on. Okay? That is the rules-based side of things. And so the discussion goes on and on. Should we use the principles-based? Should we use the rules-based? Okay? Principle is more, okay, let's just do the right thing and be ethical about it and get on with the work, no stress. Rules is, we want a bunch of detailed requirements, fill in all the paperwork, and send everything we need, put in all the details, don't leave anything out. If you leave a paragraph out, we want it to go in, tick all the boxes, sign off, get all the people who need to sign, and so on. Now, my question at the moment is to the class, which method would you prefer, principles-based or rules-based, based on what you've heard so far? Anyone? Principles-based or rules-based? Let's see. Teresa.
I'm thinking maybe a combination of both. Maybe you could start with the rules by ticking the box.
Okay.
And then you go into the principles.
That's interesting. That you came up with that actually, because that is a third perspective that, as you can see, I deliberately left out of the notes and the material, because that is a perspective that has been coming up ever so slowly, but meeting with resistance. Even though I agree with you personally, a suitable combination of the two perhaps might be the ideal thing to do instead of one or the other, because purely principle and purely rules, either way, it's going to create problems. One is too stringent, the other one is too lax, perhaps. But somehow, and I've said this to organizations on several occasions, find a way to somehow combine both, and I think we have a more effective risk management program. Okay? I haven't heard a lot of discussion yet about combining them. All I've heard so far is there are too many rules. There are too many bloody rules. There are too many rules. And then a little quieter conversation that, well, maybe we should move away from some of the rules, which implies a more principles-based approach and so on. But not a whole lot of discussion yet about the middle ground, as she mentioned, which is a combination, which can be very, very effective if we figure out how to do it properly, okay? Which is the other problem. All right. So an example then of this rules-based thing, come back to that while that other stuff simmers. A lot of persons still feel that the rules-based structure of things is just complex and mucky and too many things to write up, too many things to fill in, too many reports to send, too many things. Folks still feel that way. And some organizations actually try to find a way around it somehow, which is why oftentimes, every time they meet with an examination by a regulator, they get this little written report, report of examination says, you still didn't do this, and this. What you've done here is a start, but it doesn't cover all the relevant information. You need more information. You need more detail. You need more relevance, and so on. Okay? And so folks are griping about all the things. Okay? However, there are some people who are happy with the rules-based program. And they say that, man, this rules-based thing means that we don't have to really think about what's right or wrong. We already have it predetermined. All we need to do. And so we have, yes, two schools of thought. Those who love the rules and those who love the principles. Those who hate the principles and those who love the rules. How soon are we going to get to that middle ground that you mentioned? Well, I suspect time will tell. All right. So again, if you are thinking principles, you're moving away from prescription. Prescription means rules. The reason why we call it prescription is because it's very specific. When your doctor sends you to the pharmacy with a prescription, it has a very specific number of pills that you take, pills in the bottle, when you take it, and how you take it. That's why we say that rules are prescriptive. And just doesn't give us any room to say, well, suppose I want to take one pill instead of two. What then? And the prescription says, then get sick and die or something. You don't want to follow the prescription. There are consequences for not following the rules. Okay? And some organizations are like, fine, we'll live with those consequences. We're going by principles based how we feel, how we want to do business. Fine as if you like to. We'll just pay the fine and all this kind of stuff. Okay? So while you guys are busy onboarding and meeting all the requirements that we need to meet with our clients and doing business, a lot of these other things are going on and being discussed in other areas of the organization, specifically in senior management at the board level, and sometimes even at the shareholder level. Let's not forget them. They are stakeholders in this as well. And they have an interest in what their organizations are doing and how regulators feel about their organizations. As a matter of fact, there have been some cases where some boards or board members were actually reported to shareholders. Because sometimes when regulators prepare a report of examination or send in some information that is quote unquote negative, a lot of times there are board of directors who actually hide the information from shareholders. Imagine that. Now, I'm going to go back to Ebony. I'm going to pick on Ebony because she's a regulator. Ebony, are you still there?
Sorry, yes, I am.
Okay. Don't worry, next time I'm going to pick on Lynn, the next regulator.
That's fine.
But why do you think that there are actually some board members or boards who would get information from, say, the central bank of any country, Bahamas included, from an examination or some other issue, who would not tell the shareholders? Why would they not do that? Do they have a duty to do that?
The thing is, this is so real because I experience it from time to time.
So, true story, then I didn't make this up.
And you know, it's very true.
Okay.
It's very, yeah, it's unbelievable, but it's true. The reason for that is sometimes they are hiding things.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, persons who are regulators, for example, have to find some suitable way to unravel things sometimes. And sometimes even in our quest and our effort to unravel, depending on what senior management and boards are up to and what their agendas are, and how much risk, see, they are prepared to take to withhold information and do all kinds of other crazy stuff. It doesn't make the job easy. Okay.
Just to add, sorry.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Just to add to that, I think what I've experienced in the last few years is that people have made a career of being directors. And so their roles on these boards are not necessarily for risk management or for corporate governance, but a protection of their own personal interests. And I think that's where ethics gets in the way, and you'll see you're doing too much reporting, or you'll see information from the regulators not being filtered to other stakeholders like shareholders, because it's a compromise and a risk to their own position.
Yes. You know, I wish with all my heart that I could say that you are wrong, that you are accusing the typical board wrongly. I really wish I could, because that's what I ought to be able to say. But the truth of the matter is, in many cases, you are absolutely and unequivocally correct, which makes the job of risk management so much more difficult as a result of that. Career board members. As a matter of fact, if you check boards around the world, you'll see oftentimes they're made up of the same kinds of people who, So people they know, people who go to the same church, the same club, the same school they went to back in the day, the same whatever. And they do this at the exclusion of people they don't know, they didn't go to school with, who do not attend their church on Wednesday, or whatever reasons we have. We exclude those people on purpose because, like you said, they're career board people, and they are protecting their interests, and they will not have persons on the board who can interfere with that. In fact, a few persons who thought they could go on and be a real board member, they found themselves extricated sooner rather than later. And if they manage to run the term on the board somehow, they are not invited back. My. Now, I've been saying this from my hair was black, so that gives you an idea what color my hair is now. All right. This thing at the board level where we have these career board people and people boards that are made up of friends and relatives and tingum and tingum them, as we say in the Bahamas. I'm not saying they cannot get things done. I'm just saying, as she said, it does create this risk that persons are not going to do the things they ought to do when it comes to mitigation as often as they should, unfortunately. And I think the regulators in the Commonwealth and around the world have come up with the INED thing in an attempt to offset some of that. And these career board members, some of them, they are prepared to contaminate even the INED if they could. As a matter of fact, they try to choose an INED that is somehow connected to, so that they lose their independence as soon as they get in. And therein lies the other problem, because the INED was an ingenious solution, at least in part, to this question of independence on the board. Somebody who will say, I object, when everybody's in agreement. All in agreement say aye, and the INED say, well, I don't think so, because there's a risk involved with that product, that service, that activity, that geographic location, that PEP, that's what the INED is supposed to do. But the problem is, when they do that, they run the risk of being what? Thrown off the board or ostracized. Imagine that. And so, yeah, it's an excellent idea. The regulators continue to some extent to be frustrated by this. It does have risk implications because, see, class, look, the whole idea behind regulators coming up with INEDs is to mitigate the risk that the board will do their usual professional, their usual party thing and put the company at risk, which many of them do every single day, unfortunately, because somebody said earlier, they have their own personal agenda, their own money agendas, their own conflict of interest. Something else we're going to be talking about. Hope we can get to that before the end. Conflict of interest issues, a whole other risk dimension. And so this thing about risk, this just keeps going on and on with all kinds of little subtleties and things that are not so subtle. And depending on where you are in the landscape, you get a direct hit. And if you, depending on who you are, you get an indirect hit, and all these crazy things happening. All to avoid doing, the right thing. That's really all we're saying. But since we are career board members, see, that's a very serious expression, see? Career board members. That has an implication that is good, that is bad, and is absolutely ugly, depending on which board you run into. Okay, for sure. Man, I've worked with offshore financial institutions of all kinds in my career, okay? All the way up to what we call senior officer 2. So I've had the opportunity to see boards and senior management people do all kinds of interesting and crazy things. And here am I, former compliance officer, sometimes senior 2 and compliance, all at the same time, trying to say to them, this is not the requirement. And then they give me that stink look like, really? So whose side are you on? Some don't ask you directly, some do, depending on which board you're working for at the time, and which organization. And if you're not strong in your resolve, ladies, dog will eat your lunch. Because you know the great weapon is, if you don't like your thoughts about what you're doing, just remember who pays your bloody salary. See? The big kahuna, the salary discussion, the bonus discussion, the you don't want this job discussion. I've seen it all. I've been threatened with all of those things. And in one or two instances, they actually did it because I wouldn't change my position. And they couldn't understand why the hell I wouldn't change it. And I couldn't understand why the hell they didn't just do the right thing as is required. Well, I understood. I just found it strange that they just wouldn't. Okay? So this stuff we're talking about is very real. This is not an illusion. These concepts we're talking about on principles and ethics and rules and independence and career boards, and these things are especially real. And depending on which position you take, whether as a risk person, a compliance person, an MLRO person, you see, for example, let's take the MLRO. Somebody spots something that they think is suspicious. Well, the law says you don't have to be right. You only have to feel suspicion. And once you feel suspicion, you have to report it to your MLRO. So let's say the MLRO looks at it and says, yeah, okay, fine, that's reasonable ground for suspicion. I'm going to file a suspicious transaction report as required by law, not the board, by law. I'm filing it. I don't need anybody's opinion. The law requires it. Interestingly enough, in some organizations, they actually try to get MLROs not to file certain STRs for one reason or another. And if that happens, what should the MLRO do? Anyone? What should the MLRO do? That's the question for the floor. File or not file? Truth or dare?
File.
File, absolutely. Now, some MLROs might not agree. They might need my job. They're going to fire me if I file. They already told me that they'll mess me up. They wouldn't give me a bonus this year. They'll find another stinky MLRO and replace me or whatever they say. But whatever it is, the law requires that you file. And so therefore, in a situation like that, you should file so that you do not violate the requirements of your position. It will be so nice. See, that's the rule. See, that's the rule. It's the law, not just the rule. But it would be so nice if we combine the rules with a little principles-based activity and say, well, you know what? It makes sense to file because that's the law, and our principles-based approach, which is the hybrid we're now using, tells us that in order to avoid any kind of reputational or other problems, we should follow through. See? Simple as that. Unfortunately, in practice, it is not always that simple. And sometimes you're going to be confronted with the decision. My. And sometimes the decision you take can create great risk for you in your capacity, whatever that is. But you still have to do it. All right. So the rule would normally say one thing, and the principle would normally say the other thing. And for those of you who may have been looking for an example, I put one there just so you can see it. Okay. The difference between a rule and a principle. And see the example. Really, we transfer this stuff into our day-to-day work lives as well, sometimes without realizing it. For example, the rule says, do not drive faster than 90 miles an hour. Can you drive slower than 90 miles an hour? Anyone?
Yes.
Yes, you can. As long as you don't go over 90 miles an hour. What happens if you make 91 on the rules? What happens if you make 91 miles an hour?
Breaking the rule.
And you will get a ticket, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, when the cop stops you and say, you ran the 90 miles an hour rule, what are we going to say? It was only 1 mile an hour difference. What difference does it make? And the true answer is what? It makes no difference, correct? Between 90 and 91. So you think that the police would switch over the principles base and say, you know what? No difference between 90 and 91? Let it go. That's what a principles-based police might say. But a rules-based police, what he's going to say? 90 is 90. I don't care if it was 90 and 1 millionth thing over. You're over. Okay? And you can see right away how that can be a problem. Impractical. Okay? And why sometimes even in our world of work, it doesn't always apply very well. Principles
But
on
what
the
if,
other. Yep.
but what if my suitcase is only 51 pounds? You can't let that slide.
Aha. What should it be? What's the rule? The
It's
rule is
50, but I mean it's 51. That could scratch, right? You could scratch it to 50.
yeah.
You
Let
know,
me
overweight.
not see. Yeah, let me give you an example. Uh Theoretically, if it's 51, let it go. What the hell you mean you have to pay $100 because it's 1 pound over? Or you have to take something out and throw it away or so whatever. Eat it, whatever the case might be, just to get it back to 50. It's not really practical, but depending on what airline you go to, see, somebody might say 51, pay. You go to the other one, it says 55, still don't let you pay. It's only 5 over. See you. You're a senior citizen, forget it. Whatever the case might be. You have children, never mind. So again, we have these combinations of things that are available to us. And the question is, how should we manage them? And that is the question every single day, even in the jobs that you do in these financial institutions. Some people manage those things very well, and others don't manage them very well. In any event, they all coexist in what we call the risk environment of the firm. And the idea is to keep everybody within the organization as conscious as possible about things that could hurt the organization. And if you go over the rule a little bit, doesn't hurt anybody. Doesn't mean you should make a big deal about it. Probably not. And somebody will come back and say, well, if you go over a little, then somebody else will go over a little, and then you have a lot of littles. So again, we're back to square one as to whether we should be strict in the administration or whether we should be able to exercise good judgment. And so we still have two schools of thought, that we should be strict in the position, and then the other side that says we should exercise good judgment. By all means. It's like somebody steals a loaf of bread and you send them to prison. That makes sense, anyone?
No.
No. Now, some people come back and say, well, thief is thief. See, that's how we say in the Bahamas. Thief is thief. You should, and if you're thief, you go to prison. We get that. Strictly administered, yes, you've stolen, and because of that, you should go to prison. But of course, I mean, there's risk even in that. Because you send a person to prison for stealing a loaf of bread, they come out worse than they went in for just stealing a loaf of bread. And now you have a career criminal, because all kinds of things. That's the one hand. Then on the other hand, why send somebody, a criminal record for a loaf of bread? Just let them clean up downtown, correct? How about that? And if they steal another loaf, don't get mad and say, I should have locked you up the first time, then let them clean up the other side of town. So if they steal loaves of bread, the whole island will be clean soon, wouldn't it? Anyone? without creating unnecessary. The whole idea is in this exercise that we're doing, we expect it to exercise good judgment, good ethical practices, good mitigating skills, and so on, in order to keep our organization protected. The only problem with that is sometimes we always have persons who are in contradiction. And sometimes those persons are at the very top of the firm. And unfortunately, when the problem is at the top of anything, it's messier and it's harder to fix. Unfortunately. Okay? But we all have to try to do our part. Whether we are in the regulatory side of the business, the risk management side of the business, just the regular employees doing business. Because remember, those persons who work in the firm, they are critical to this process as well, because they're the ones who see things. They're the ones who see what's going on, more so than even those of us who have the responsibility for mitigation and monitoring. They are frontliners down the line, exactly. And so they too should always be encouraged to be doing this kind of thing. And then when they try to do it, we should follow through. Unfortunately, sometimes we tell them you're responsible for recognizing risk in the organization, helping us to mitigate and get things right. And then when they come, nothing happens. So the next time they see something like, man, it doesn't make sense, wasting my time, because nothing happens. So is this thing is this risk thing black and white? Hell no. Never was, never is, never will be. However, we have to still try every day to keep it to what we call a minimum. Can we mitigate all risk? No, never, impossible. But we sure as hell can try to minimize and mitigate as much as we can on a daily basis in an effort to keep our organizations functioning properly to the greatest possible extent, God forbid. All right. So then, with these things in mind about the organizations you work for, what kind of business practices or principles then you should be thinking about from a compliance risk perspective? And I provided kind of a not long list, but quite a few interesting things, I hope, about how firms should be conducting themselves. Doesn't matter what type of firm it is, whether it's a private buying trust company, money remitters, legal firm, accounting firms, all these deemed financial services, whatever they might be. There's some fundamental things that we should always be thinking about all the time in terms of the organizations we work for. Look at a couple of things I put here. A firm must conduct its business with integrity. See, right at the top. I know that's easier said than done, but it has to be attempted. Staff have to be aware. Senior management should be telling staff this in meetings with staff, making sure at all times that they remind staff of their responsibility to exercise integrity. And of course, once you tell your people to do that, they will be watching you as senior management to see if you are practicing what you preach, which is another problem. Because some people are preaching compliance and good ethics, good behavior in the firm, but they're not practicing it. And so employees are looking over and thinking, what the hell is this? You're telling us to do one thing, but we all know that you guys and girls are doing something else. That kind of contradiction is a problem in itself. Okay? So conduct the business with integrity. Conduct the business with skill, care, and diligence. See that crap every day. That's easier said than done in some organizations. Take reasonable care to do what you do responsibly and try to keep your risk issues to a minimum. Man, that's only 3 points, and that's a big old task. We could spend a lifetime messing with that. in any typical organization, even those that are not financial, like the places you work, even as regulators or otherwise. We have these problems in other organizations like Parliament and church and all these things. Question? All right. So that's just 3. And we could spend a lifetime messing with that. But look at some others. Maintain adequate financial resources. Now, why is that in there? Because some firms are being run into the ground by the persons who run them. Now, some of you might work for organizations that are so quote unquote big that they could run off and do all kinds of crazy stuff and still survive and continue on. But not every organization is like that. And we have seen some organizational failures like Enron and others who are multi-billion-dollar companies that went down. Took auditing firms down with them like Anderson. Never to rise again. No Phoenix there. And if any of you are familiar with Enron, Enron was one of the largest companies in the world, maybe the largest, multi-billion-dollar firm. You know what brought Enron down? A lack of bloody integrity. Imagine that. Poor, dishonest accounting practices. Imagine that. Dishonest accounting practices. Those guys were trying to put some numbers in the income statement and the sales category that never existed. Those guys were converting expenses to assets so that the real expenses in the gazillions of dollars were not reflected in the income statement, so that the income statement can show gazillions of dollars in net profit, giving a false indication that the company was doing exceptionally well while they were hiding pertinent information regarding expenses and loan commitments on and off the books, in the books, until eventually things came crashing down and everybody discovered that Enron was not as strong as they were reflecting themselves to be in the financial statements. Persons lost their pensions that they worked at Enron for 20, 30, 40 years, lost everything. Some people committed suicide. They couldn't live with it. Imagine that. Arthur Anderson was around, an accounting firm around for 80 plus years. Imagine that. They participated in the false reporting in their audit. And they too went down like the Titanic, never to rise again. All because of these same things, these risk things we're talking about. And all they had to do was to stop being bloody greedy, see, and dishonest, and do things the right way, and Enron and all its glory may still have been around even today, not to mention Arthur Anderson. How the hell an 80-year-old audit firm, well, money. I was about to say how the hell they got sucked into it. But money is a strange, bad fellow when it comes to doing this job and many other jobs. And oftentimes, somebody said earlier, we have these career board members. Part of this career board member thing has to do with money and emoluments and benefits and more benefits and more benefits. So much so that money and benefits override the job they're there to do. All falling under these same business principles. If we only did half of these in the firm, in certain firms, they'd suffer far less than many of them do in terms of fines and regulatory issues and legal issues, compliance issues. But they don't want to follow even half of these principles. A firm must observe proper standards of market conduct. Stop inside trading, stop short selling, stop taking risks with people's money. and security. That's really all it's saying. But there's always a gang somewhere who wants to take a shot at violating all of these principles in some cases. And that's why sometimes we have the problems we have. Again, some firms are big enough, they can do it, get away with it. Others, they don't get away. They suffer tremendously or they disappear forever. Look at the next point. A firm, that's where you work, must pay regard to the customers and to treat them fairly. Now, those of you who may be working, for example, for a trust company, you have high net worth clients, medium and low net worth clients, and so on. But yet they are clients. But some trust companies, because of their size and their gender, sometimes they treat the client in a way that is not satisfactory, believe it or not. Okay? As it is in other organizations and the services they provide to their clients, which is why sometimes clients get pissed off and get, I'm leaving this bloody place. I'm moving my trust. I'm moving my account. I'm moving everything from this bloody place because we violate that. We try to treat them a way we shouldn't treat them. And while I'm at it, I'm telling everybody that you people suck. See? All because we violate that one. Take them for granted. Then look at the other point. In addition to treatment, here's the other problem we have. Communication. How we communicate information to the client. Is it clear? Do they understand it? Or are we deliberately confusing them for some reason? Is it fair? Is it not misleading? Imagine that. Why the hell do we want to do that to our customers? Because we do. And when I say we, I don't mean every firm. That's not what I mean. These are just some companies. Sometimes too many of some. Okay. And why are we here? Because we're discussing risk, regulation, mitigation, and all those kinds of things to help us to minimize these kinds of problems. It's a huge challenge. It's kind of a long list, actually, and it's not exhaustive either. Imagine that. It's already 3 slides, and it's not exhaustive. Firms must manage conflicts of interest fairly. My God, we'll talk about them later. Take reasonable care to ensure that the customer can rely on the firm's judgment, that they don't mistrust what you're doing. Some firms operate in such a way you can't believe anything they do. It's spooky. And sometimes customers pick up on it. Protect clients' assets. Handle them carefully. Don't defraud your customers. Don't steal from your customers. Don't abuse your customers' assets. Consider your fiduciary responsibility to them. All of these are risk-related issues. When we violate any of these things, we're creating the risk that our reputation will be tarnished, that customers will badmouth us elsewhere, that word will get to other places and people that it need not go, that can harm our level of business. Because remember, you don't have to necessarily go out of business. You can still be in, but you just may not end up getting the amount that you could have if you didn't find yourself in these kinds of situations. All right. Guess I bombarded that quite a bit. And I did because these are still very practical, ongoing, real issues that are occurring in organizations as we speak. And perhaps to some extent, even in some of your organizations, whether you are aware of them or not. So, what are the advantages then of following the rules-based prescription? Well, we believe those who agree with the rules-based that there's greater clarity and certainty. Everybody knows what to do. There's no doubt. There's no ambiguity. There's greater transparency. You don't have to try and figure out who's thinking what and who's suggesting why. It's just there, tick it off and let's go. Submit it, it's done, send a copy, put it on the file, sign it first, and then it's done. Great operational activity, everybody's happier. We don't have to worry about what part of it is right, what part of it is wrong, what part of it is ethical, and so on. So those are the advantages. Disadvantages, you need a lot of compliance activity to get it done. People can lose their innovation. You just keep ticking the box, you stop thinking. It's like, for example, we use a calculator so often, somebody says 2 times 2, we say, hold on, let me get my calculator. We forget that we can just do it in our heads and say 4. Sometimes too much box ticking can turn us into robots, quote unquote. And so we don't innovate anymore. We don't think out of the box anymore. We don't think of anything creative anymore. Just tick the box, sign it, and go home. Okay. Then there's the problem of litigation. Using the rules-based approach, people get mad at the rules and sue, take action in court for any number of reasons. Okay? And let's not forget the capital markets. Those of you who work for brokerage firms and work in the capital markets do not like prescriptive rules, too strict. When you're in the capital markets buying and selling, you need to do things a little faster, with little less red tape and so on. Too much prescriptions means things will slow down, get a little more expensive. You have to hire more people, deal with more processes. You can't make your investments as quickly and so on. So the capital markets are not happy about it because of those kinds of things, because it's a different environment and it needs to move far more quickly than other business transactions. Okay? Notice in this picture, the investor is saying to the lady, could you bring me the new investing regulations you downloaded yesterday? And what does she say? I'm sorry, it's still downloading. And the question is, why the hell is the regulation so long? And part of the reason for that is because folks are involved in so much criminal and unethical and fraudulent activity. Companies and countries and regulators and others have felt that they need to have detailed, prescriptive regulations and processes that govern the day-to-day to try to suppress all of this crazy, unethical, fraudulent, illegal, criminal stuff that still goes on within the organization. Does all the regulations work? No. Sometimes it helps significantly, but folks are always willing to try and get around the regulations. Let's not forget the guys we saw earlier. While this is downloading to be implemented, these guys are planning how to get around it. And that's the problem we have every single day in our organizations, whether we're aware of it or not. All right, so the principles based, what are the advantages of that side of the fence? Well, we know now it's more flexible. You can think out of the box. You're not stuck with just filling in the blanks. Discussions are more productive. You can talk to each other more about things that are prescriptive. There's not much talking to, just fill it in. What are we talking about? Nothing to talk about. Fill it in, sign it. That's it. Okay. So this prescriptive thing is much more open, much more flexible. You can have more conversations. You can grow and develop better. They believe in the day-to-day because you get to talk more and interact more. Things are more robust in the organization using the principles base. And to some extent, that is true. Okay? So I think we're beginning to see now, is from a risk perspective, that the hybrid that somebody mentioned earlier is probably a good idea. Is it the best? Well, not necessarily. As a matter of fact, It might be at some point in the near future that we don't pick a best one. And that's just my opinion. Instead, we have all three at our disposal and we use them as appropriate. Now, in terms of our management of risk, however, don't get me wrong, that is easier said than done. But it is doable over time if you can eventually get your stakeholders within the organization, your staff and your board and your senior management, your shareholders and everybody on board. It's doable. So we have these three options. We use either one of them or any combination depending on what we're dealing with. So when we're at the board level discussing strategic risk, we don't want to get bogged down in too much prescriptive stuff. We want to talk about the major risk factors from a principles base that are going to impact us. And then as we go down the line in the organization, we go more from principles-based issues to what we call more prescriptive basis, depending on what we are doing down the line. And then given a particular area or department in the organization, then we might look at a combination of the two. So my point is that yes, all of them have their significant risk implications, but perhaps the really innovative firm might somehow in the future look at having all three of them available and never really giving any of the three an advantage. We just use them as appropriate. All right. Any disadvantages with principles? Yes, there's uncertainty, unpredictability, and supervising a principles-based organization is not as easy as supervising a risk-based because we don't have all the ticking of the boxes. We just have a couple of reports, some board minutes, some discussions about where we're going, and some regular monthly, quarterly reports, and so on. So yeah, but like everything else, there are the advantages and the disadvantages, and we have to just look at them and see which situations will help us to mitigate our risk, to keep us from being exposed. See, that's the point. All right. So now we're on to this paradox word. And the reason why I put this here, because a lot of persons work in organizations where paradoxes occur all the time, you just don't know it. Strange things are happening like the Twilight Zone right where you work, and you may not even be aware of it. But these strange things sometimes have risk implications. Whether they're regulatory risk, compliance risk, legal risk, credit risk, market risk, or reputational risk, whatever they are, we need to at least be aware that they're always there staring us in the face. And so some of these paradoxes just remind us, I believe, of some of the things that are out there in our environment. For example, the first paradox we have is the interpretive. And what do we mean by that? We mean that principles can be general yet precise. Now, that's a paradox. How can it be general and precise? Well, time and experience will help us to understand how that happens, and we'll know it when we see it, now that we understand it exists. Okay? Can somebody think of something that can be general yet precise at this hour of the night? General yet precise. I know it's not easy, it's a paradox. What about everybody should not exceed the speed limit of 90 miles per hour? Is that general yet precise? Maybe. But I think you're getting the idea. How do we interpret it if it's general yet precise? Then we have the communicative paradox, which says people can facilitate communication, but can also hinder. So principles-based allows us to talk about things more openly than prescription, yet at the same time, we fail to talk about things we should talk about. And so therefore it hinders the progress we can make. Paradoxes, okay? You guys, the compliance paradox. Principles provide scope for flexibility in compliance, if there's such a thing called flexibility in compliance, yet can lead to conservative and or uniform behavior by regulated firms. So in the compliance area, the paradox is we want to be as flexible as we can without too much box ticking if we can help it, yet because of the nature of compliance, we still get stuck with the uniform restrictive requirements of compliance itself. Just another paradox that we have to face every single day in one form or another. Supervision enforcement, that's who's that, Ebony and Lynn. This is their paradox. Principals need enforcement to give them credibility, but over-enforcement can lead to their demise. So while some oversight is great, too much oversight can really kill the spirit of the process. Strange paradox. On one hand, it strengthens, on the other hand, it discourages. Welcome to the world of paradox. And notice we have a paradox for all the things that affect us, interpretation of what we do, how we communicate, our compliance environment, our supervision and enforcement. Internal management paradox, let's see. PBR can provide flexibility for internal control systems to develop, but can also overload them at the same time by coming up with too many things too frequently that need to be done in order to try and cover all of the requirements that organizations need to meet. Okay? Then we have the ethical paradox, which can facilitate a more ethical approach, but it can also result in an erosion of ethics. So while we encourage people to be more open and just talk and get things done, because we don't have too much box ticking and people watching us closely and so on, we start planning to do the wrong thing, unethical stuff, the long rope that chokes the person kind of thing. Okay? And then the last but not least, the trust paradox, where PBR can give rise to relationships of trust, because we're all out here discussing the principles of how things should work, what's right, what's wrong. Trust and mutuality, we're all in the same boat, and responsibility, everybody's happy. Trust, mutuality, and responsibility. That's what I'm talking about with principles. But despite all of this, these are the very relationships which have to exist for it to be effective. So, on the one hand, we have openness, and on the other hand, it closes. Contradictions, paradoxes. If you ever see them in your work, don't be surprised. Just try to understand what they are, what kind of risks they might present for your organization, and see if you can mitigate those risks. Okay? That's really the whole idea. Now, are you going to remember them in this ethical trust communicate? No, not necessarily. But certainly, as you go about day to day and you see some contradictions, it should remind you of the word paradox. I see paradoxes all the time. For example, if you are the head of a department and they said that all transactions pertaining to your department should go through you, yet from time to time, your boss, who's over you, routes transactions through someone else for some reason. Is that a paradox, anyone? Or that's just what people do? Could be a paradox depending on where you work. Okay? It doesn't make sense they'd route it somewhere else after we all agreed that it should come through you. Okay? Happens all the time. And again, wherever you work, your paradoxes might be different, but I can assure you, they're looking around somewhere. Okay? Which you are. All right. So, Did I go over the time tonight, everybody? Did I?
No.
I'm not over
No,
the time. Okay. How much more time do I have?
like 10 minutes.
Okay. So, what can I do in 10 minutes? Okay. I know you guys, it's amazing that you guys can come in and mess with all this crazy stuff after all their work. That in itself is a paradox. See that word? To be exceptionally tired and all that from all the day's work and then still come in and doggone sit through stuff. That's a paradox in itself, perhaps. All right. So let's use the next few minutes to introduce ourselves to conflict of interest issues. I hope all of us in this room have an idea what a conflict of interest is. Anyone? Let's see. Let's pick up somebody in the market. Shirella, what is a conflict of interest?
I guess it's a good example would be, for example, having someone who's making decisions with the business. Okay, like for me, as a compliance person sitting on the board, we know that the board performs oversight, and for me to be on the board, where is the independence in the decision making? So it could be a conflict of interest.
Indeed. And that is just one of many types of conflicts that exist potentially within an organization. And it's important we recognize what they are, because some of them we can sometimes live with depending on what they are, and others we should not entertain nor tolerate. Okay? Because conflict of interest issues can create risk for the organization and put the organization at great risk in some instances because of the conflict of interest issues. And so this is a very important part of the risk discussion about organizations of any kind, not only financial institutions. And to keep in mind that we have to be able to recognize conflict of interest issues. We have to be able to know whether they are good for our organization or even for us or not. And we have to know how we're going to take steps to resolve them if we find ourselves in a conflict of interest situation. Okay? Very important. A lot of people operate in conflict of interest situations all the time. Everybody knows that it's a conflict. And everybody knows it's a conflict that should not be tolerated because of. Right? All right. So what are some examples then of conflicts of interest? Well, first of all, we're given a very bad set of words to describe conflict of interest. We're told it's a moral hazard because conflict of interest issues tend to mess with our morality to begin with. Even before we get to the firm level, it's a moral hazard. Okay? Because whatever we're doing within our organizations that conflicts with what's going on in that organization in a negative way, then that kind of conflict of interest needs attention. Okay? What should you do when you find yourself in a conflict of interest situation? As a matter of fact, a typical company should have conflict of interest issues as part of their policy. So employees can go and read how to deal with conflict of interest issues within the firm. I'm not sure how many firms actually have conflict of interest issues in it for staff, but it should perhaps have it. Okay? All right. Conflict of interest issues usually takes the form of misleading information. See? Misleading information often leads to a conflict of interest. Lying, telling the wrong thing, not properly disclosing, not fully disclosing. Financial institutions can profit from giving out misleading information to the public. Imagine that. What a conflict that is. Because we have a moral and professional and ethical responsibility and sometimes legal responsibility to tell our customers the truth. But telling the public the truth about our products. Does it really cause cancer or not? If you know for a fact it causes cancer, stop producing it, stop selling it, disclose the truth so people can know and go ahead and take any action to resolve it before it becomes an even bigger problem. But if you say, no, it doesn't create any problems, we've tested it, and you know it to be untrue, and you allow people to continue, public, customers, etc., man, that is clearly an unethical conflict of interest issue that firms have to try to avoid at all costs. We know that many firms do not do that. Sometimes they lie deliberately to the public. They know they're lying. Sometimes the public knows they know they're lying. Yet they don't change the narrative. Okay? Conflict of interest issue leads to unethical behavior. It occurs in an institution where you work, where an employee serves his own personal interest at the expense of other people, see? All the way from the board level, all the way down. Conflict of interest issues. How do we resolve them? Look at the example of the director. In this case, the director may become what? Legally liable if his conflict of interest breaches his duty of loyalty to the firm or impacts or affects his duty to act in good faith as a fiduciary in the best, not the good interest, not the better interest, the best interest of his or her company, period. So really, our money issues and our greed issues and our desire to get all kinds of perks and benefits and do other crazy stuff we do at that level should not take priority over the responsibility of being a director. A director requires that you stay away from conflict of interest issues, deal in a moral way with issues, stay ethical in your behavior, keep risk to a minimum, and when you see it, disclose it, not hide it, so that it can be resolved. Well, that all sounds like a great sermon on a Sunday morning for a lot of boards. Like, yeah, right. See you on Sunday. Because they know very well that they're not doing that. And some of them know very well that they don't have any intention of doing it. Because somebody said earlier, let's not forget the expression, career board members. That is not necessarily a nice expression. It's probably a euphemistic expression for something very terrible that goes on at the board level that creates a whole lot of the risk issues that we're talking about. Unfortunately. It's like a parent who abuses his or her child. They bring the child in the world and they're responsible for the child. Yet their behavior is one of abuse and neglect and downright stinky stuff. Some organization boards are like that with their companies because all they're interested in is their own self-interest programs, which, by the way, is probably a board paradox or maybe a conflict of interest paradox. See? Because on the one hand, they should be looking after the fiduciary interests of the company, yet on the other hand, they're only looking at themselves and what they can get. Welcome to paradoxes, in case you didn't see it before. Look at where conflicts can occur everywhere. Financially, professionally, personally, and prejudicially. How about that? Prejudicially even. In case you didn't know, prejudice is not only I don't like somebody because of the skin color, we have all kinds of other prejudices as well. When you get a moment, check some of them out. And you can probably and eventually see how they can create conflict of interest issues within the firm. And again, all of these things, whether you believe it or not, whether you're aware of it or not, create risk issues. Like we always say, from reputational all the way down, we can think at least 3 to 5 immediately, anytime when these things occur. Okay? Food for thought. And so what I'm going to leave you with tonight is just this little list of the types of conflicts for you to ponder so that when we come back, we can see what kind of effect they have on what we do in our organizations. Okay? Number one, self-dealing. What does that mean? That means that at any level, whether it's the board level or down within the organization, when we are self-dealing, that means we're looking after things for our own personal self-interest. The hell with the organizational objectives. I'm here to get what I can get, and that is very prevalent up at the board level and oftentimes, sometimes down the line, depending on who we are. But in any event, this fiduciary responsibility that they have at the board level and the senior management level to do everything possible to protect the interests of shareholders and the assets of the company and the interests of its employees who expect to stay there and work and save their pensions or whatever it is, that is a huge responsibility. And self-dealing runs contrary to that concept, because self-dealing means I'm only here to get what I can get. And whatever the hell happens after that, too bad. Self-dealing, serious. Number two, outside employment. You'd be happy to know that all outside employment is not a no-no. But any outside employment that contradicts where you work, like you work for the competition, that's not good. So if you're in financial services and you want to go and work at the crap tables at the hotel, might be okay. You may have to get approval for it, but there may not be any direct contradiction, unless, of course, that casino is doing business with your company. Then all of a sudden, it becomes an issue. You have to leave that job, because if that casino is now your client, you probably shouldn't be working for them. Okay? So some conflict issues are okay until something else happens, and then it's not okay. Number three, hiring family. It's my friends. Lovers is not there. Business associates. It's a problem. Now notice it says without authorization or consent. That means some kinds of hiring may be considered acceptable if it's approved by the board, I guess. And I suspect that some kinds of hiring is not acceptable even if it's approved by the board, which we see all too often. We ask ourselves a lot, how did that person get in that position and what qualified them for that job? And why are they getting 3 times the salary I'm getting, and I'm the one who's qualified and working? Whatever the case might be, it creates a conflict. And these conflicts create risk in one form or another. Sometimes risks that you never believed or imagined. But they are real. That's why they're here. Okay? You'd be shocked to know what kinds of risks can come out of hiring family, friends, and business associates. Period. I'm not saying that some of those situations don't work properly, but your risk level goes up depending on who they are, for sure. Okay? Number 4, receiving gifts. My. From potential investors in the company, your clients, your service providers, and all this kind of stuff. Typically, that should not happen. It creates a conflict of interest that might interfere with your independence in doing your job, depending on what job you do, especially if you are in risk mitigation like compliance, MLRO, and risk management, and especially those groups. Other persons as well, board members as well, senior management, the teller, all of us in the organization have to be careful what gifts we receive from those who bear gifts. Because when we work in our organizations, those who bear gifts are not necessarily bearing them because they are nice, kind people. Oftentimes, there's a motive. And so we have to be very careful about persons who come in our organizations or outside our organizations bearing gifts. Okay? So I'm going to stop there so you guys can mull on those types of conflicts until we meet next time. And then we'll pick it up and see how we can best deal with them. Should we deal with them at all? Why do they even exist in the first place? And then what other kinds of issues, as if we haven't seen enough already, that can arise, that can create risk management problems for us on any given day. All right, you guys have been fantastic considering the long day you've had. Please, I shall see you again next week when we'll finish up our discussion on some other risk issues. And good luck out there as you try to maneuver in whatever sea you are in. All right, take care and be safe.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, take care.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Mr. Wilkinson?
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, you have a minute?
Certainly.
Okay, I have a question that's not directly related to module
No
5
problem.
regulation. This is in the context of developing a risk controls self-assessment.
Yes.
And I was having a difficult time because I'm a part of Central Bank's risk team,
Right.
basically assessing the impact of residual risk.
Yes.
And so I'm not sure whether the question I should be asking myself is, even if the controls are, I guess, operating optimally,
Right.
or the impact, or even if the controls are operating optimally, being able to assess whether the risk should increase or decrease, or should I be asking myself considering the risk, or without the control, what the impact would be? So should I consider the control or not consider the control, basically, is what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah. Oh, actually, perhaps the best approach would be to consider both questions. For example, if there are no controls in place, that's the one situation, and we know that exposes the organization entirely to all kinds of issues and problems. On the other hand, those organizations that have certain controls in place, depending on how we exercise those controls, they could considerably mitigate the risk that we have, but not eliminate them to the extent that we could still potentially have residual risk. For example, let's say you decide a PEP wants to open up an account with a financial institution. Now, not every PEP is somebody that you shouldn't do business with. They might just be deemed a PEP because of association, etc. So that doesn't make it mean that they're not a good business potential. And so let's say we do all the necessary work with the PEP and presume that everything is in order. So we've done everything we're supposed to do to mitigate against the risk and make sure that the onboarding is correct and so on. All the controls are in place. Yet, maybe after the person is onboarded, we later on discover something that we missed in our original check. See my point?
Yes.
Yeah, and so therefore, as a result of that, yes, we put in place all the controls, we did all the things we're supposed to do.
Right.
Yeah, because we missed something, or and this thing we missed could be something deliberate on behalf of the PEP, so to speak, or maybe it could be something that they may not have been aware of that would have impacted them, and then we discover it subsequent to onboarding. And so now we have the residual risk because the person has already been onboarded. And so now,
right.
Yeah, so what do we do? Do we keep them, or do we find a way to close the account and get rid of the business, so to speak? And so that kind of residual risk is always very, very possible. And that's one of, in my opinion, one of the better examples of how residual risk can apply. And so we can take that concept and look at other risk factors within the organization and say, okay, what is there any potential residual risk here, and what could that possibly be?
Right.
And the answer to that for somebody in your situation could be a combination of what you guys come up with as regulators and what the company perceives it to be. So again, it's important to get even feedback from them as to what they think the residual risk might be. And you take that information and then put it together with your information and decide, okay, this gives us a good perspective on the residual risk of this, this, and this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that might be the best initial approach to dealing with the residual risk side of the risk assessment process. Because you know, the initial side is pretty manageable, trying to get people, okay, tell us what products you have, what kind of risk they present, and so you could work that to some extent. Now the question is, okay, do you have any residual risk? And some people are like, really, what do you mean by that? They don't even know what you mean by that. And sometimes for some organization, you may have to try to explain it a little bit. And then it's, oh, that's what you mean. And then they start to give you a little feedback that you can then take and put together with your work and come up with a perspective of what residual risk consideration should be.
Right. Okay, great. And so essentially the impact of that residual risk may not necessarily decrease if the controls of that risk is operating 100% the way it should be operating.
Yeah, your point is taken. I mean, we know that 100% doesn't necessarily mean 100%, but we know that 100% means what we want it to mean. We've done everything that we should do.
Right.
The truth of the matter is, even after doing everything we should do, sometimes there could be the possibility of residual risk. And we have to try to give consideration to it and try to define it whenever we can. Because to not consider residual risk and to not try to define it is risk in itself. Okay?
Right.
So organizations should be encouraged to try and define what residual risk is after something passes the normal program, and then so that should it occur, they will not be taken by surprise, and they would have already been given considerations on how to manage it if it happens.
Okay. Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. That helps a lot.
That helps?
Yes, sir.
Fantastic. Good luck out there. It is not the easiest thing to be dealing with because it's so subtle. In some ways, see, it's paradoxical too. Okay?
Exactly.
In its context. And so you can't really get like a direct grip on it. You just have to keep grappling it and keep working it in the context so that hopefully eventually everybody would become comfortable with it to some extent, and then you can manage it a little bit better.
Right.
It's not going to be a perfect situation initially for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay.
Take care.
Good night. You too.